Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Graveyard Rats by Henry Kuttner. Weird Tales, March 1936. Old Mason, the caretaker of one of Salem's oldest and most neglected cemeteries, had a feud with the rats. Generations ago they had come up from the wharves and settled in the graveyard, a colony of abnormally large rats, and when Masson had taken charge after the inexplicable disappearance of the former caretaker, he decided that they must go. At first he set traps for them and put poisoned food by their burrows, and later he tried to shoot them, but it did no good. The rats stayed, multiplying and overrunning the graveyard with their ravenous hordes. They were large, even for the Mus decumanus, which sometimes measures 15 inches in length. Exclusive of the naked pink and grey tail, Masson had caught glimpses of some as large as good-sized cats, and when, once or twice, the gravediggers had uncovered their burrows, the malodorous tunnels were large enough to enable a man to crawl into them on his hands and knees. The ships that had come generations ago from distant ports to the rotting Salem wharves had brought strange cargoes. Masson wondered sometimes at the extraordinary size of these burrows. He recalled certain vaguely disturbing legends he had heard since coming to ancient, witch-haunted Salem, tales of a moribund, inhuman life that was said to exist in forgotten burrows in the earth. The old days, when Cotton Mather had hunted down the evil cults that worshipped Hecate and the Dark Magnomator in frightful orgies, had passed, but dark-gabled houses still leaned perilously towards each other over narrow cobbled streets, and blasphemous secrets and mysteries were said to be hidden in subterranean cellars and caverns, where forgotten pagan rites were still celebrated in defiance of law and sanity. Wagging their grey heads wisely, the elders declared that there were worse things than rats and maggots crawling in the unhallowed earth of the ancient Salem cemeteries. And then, too, there was this curious dread of the rats. Masson disliked and respected the ferocious little rodents, for he knew the danger that lurked in their flashing, needle-sharp fangs, but he could not understand the inexplicable horror which the oldsters held for deserted, rat-infested houses. He had heard vague rumors of ghoulish beings that dwelt far underground, and that had the power of commanding the rats, marshalling them like horrible armies. The rats, the old men whispered, were messengers between this world and the grim and ancient caverns far below Salem. Bodies had been stolen from graves for nocturnal subterranean feasts, they said. The myth of the Pied Piper is a fable that hides a blasphemous horror, and the black pits of Avernus have brought forth hell-spawned monstrosities that never venture into the light of day. Masson paid little attention to these tales. He did not fraternize with his neighbors, and in fact, did all he could to hide the existence of the rats from intruders. Investigation, he realized, would undoubtedly mean the opening of many graves, and while some of the gnawed empty coffins could be attributed to the activities of the rats, Masson might find it difficult to explain the mutilated bodies that lay in some of the coffins. The purest gold is used in filling teeth, and this gold is not removed when a man is buried. Clothing, of course, is another matter, for usually the undertaker provides a plain broadcloth suit that is cheap and easily recognizable. But gold is another matter, and sometimes too there were medical students and less reputable doctors who were in need of cadavers, and not over-scrupulous as to where these were obtained. So far Masson had successfully managed to discourage investigation. He had fiercely denied the existence of the rats, even though they sometimes robbed him of his prey. Masson did not care what happened to the bodies after he had performed his gruesome thefts, but the rats inevitably dragged away the whole cadaver through the hole they gnawed in the coffin. The size of these burrows occasionally worried Masson. Then, too, there was the curious circumstance of the coffins always being gnawed open at the end, never at the side or top. It was almost as though the rats were working under the direction of some impossibly intelligent leader. Now he stood in an open grave and threw a last sprinkling of wet earth on the heap beside the pit. It was raining, a slow, cold drizzle that for weeks had been descending from soggy black clouds. The graveyard was a slough of yellow, sucking mud from which the rain-washed tombstones stood up in irregular battalions. The rats had retreated to their burrows, and Masson had not seen one for days. But his gaunt, unshaved face was set in frowning lines. The coffin on which he was standing was a wooden one. The body had been buried several days earlier, but Masson had not dared to disinter it before. A relative of the dead man had been coming to the grave at intervals, even in the drenching rain. But he would hardly come at this late hour, no matter how much grief he might be suffering, Masson thought, grinning wryly. He straightened and laid the shovel aside. From the hill on which the ancient graveyard lay, he could see the lights of Salem flickering dimly through the downpour. He drew a flashlight from his pocket. He would need light now. Taking up the spade, he bent and examined the fastenings of the coffin. Abruptly he stiffened. Beneath his feet he sensed an unquiet stirring and scratching, as though something were moving within the coffin. For a moment a pang of superstitious fear shot through Masson, and then rage replaced it as he realized the significance of the sound. The rats had forestalled him again. In a paroxysm of anger, Masson wrenched at the fastenings of the coffin. He got the sharp edge of the shovel under the lid, and pried it up until he could finish the job with his hands. Then he sent the flashlight's cold beam darting down into the coffin. Rain spattered against the white satin lining. The coffin was empty. Masson saw a flicker of movement at the head of the case, and darted the light in that direction. The end of the sarcophagus had been gnawed through, and a gaping hole led into darkness. A black shoe, limp and dragging, was disappearing as Masson watched, and abruptly he realized that the rats had forestalled him by only a few minutes. He fell on his hands and knees and made a hasty clutch at the shoe, and the flashlight incontinently fell into the coffin and went out. The shoe was tugged from his grasp. He heard a sharp, excited squealing, and then he had the flashlight again and was darting its light into the burrow. It was a large one. It had to be, or the corpse could not have been dragged along it. Masson wondered at the size of the rats that could carry away a man's body, but the thought of the loaded revolver in his pocket fortified him. Probably if the corpse had been an ordinary one, Masson would have left the rats with their spoils rather than venture into the narrow burrow, but he remembered an especially fine set of cufflinks he had observed, as well as a stick pin that was undoubtedly a genuine pearl. With scarcely a pause, he clipped the flashlight to his belt and crept into the burrow. It was a tight fit, but he managed to squeeze himself along. Ahead of him in the flashlight's glow, he could see the shoes dragging along the wet earth of the bottom of the tunnel. He crept along the burrows as rapidly as he could, occasionally barely able to squeeze his lean body through the narrow walls. The air was overpowering with its musty stench of carrion. If he could not reach the corpse in a minute, Masson decided he would turn back. Belated fears were beginning to crawl, maggot-like, within his mind, but greed urged him on. He crawled forward, several times passing the mouths of adjoining tunnels. The walls of the burrow were damp and slimy, and twice lumps of dirt dropped behind him. The second time he paused and screwed his head around to look back. He could see nothing, of course, until he had unhooked the flashlight from his belt and reversed it. Several clods lay on the ground behind him, and the danger of his position suddenly became real and terrifying. With thoughts of a cave in making his pulse race, he decided to abandon the pursuit, even though he had now almost overtaken the corpse and the invisible things that pulled it. But he had overlooked one thing: the burrow was too narrow to allow him to turn. Panic touched him briefly, but he remembered a side tunnel he had just passed, and backed awkwardly along the tunnel until he came to it. He thrust his legs into it, backing until he found himself able to turn. Then he hurriedly began to retrace his way, although his knees were bruised and painful. Agonizing pain shot through his leg. He felt sharp teeth sink into his flesh and kicked out frantically. There was a shrill squealing and the scurry of many feet. Flashing the light behind him, Masson caught his breath in a sob of fear as he saw a dozen great rats watching him intently, their slitted eyes glittering in the light. They were great misshapen things, as large as cats, and behind them he caught a glimpse of a dark shape that stirred and moved swiftly aside into the shadow, and he shuddered at the unbelievable size of the thing. The light had held them for a moment, but they were edging closer, their teeth dull orange in the pale light. Masson tugged at his pistol, managed to extricate it from his pocket, and aimed carefully. It was an awkward position, and he tried to press his feet into the soggy sides of the burrow so that he should not inadvertently send a bullet into one of them. The rolling thunder of the shot deafened him for a time, and the clouds of smoke set him coughing. When he could hear again and the smoke had cleared, he saw that the rats were gone. He put the pistol back and began to creep swiftly along the tunnel, and then with a scurry and a rush they were upon him again. They swarmed over his legs, biting and squealing insanely, and Masson shrieked horribly as he snatched for his gun. He fired without aiming, and only luck saved him from blowing a foot off. This time the rats did not retreat so far, but Masson was crawling as swiftly as he could along the burrow, ready to fire again at the first sound of another attack. There was a patter of feet, and he sent the light stabbing behind him. A great grey rat paused and watched him. Its long, ragged whiskers twitched, and its scabrous, naked tail was moving slowly from side to side. Masson shouted and the rat retreated. He crawled on, pausing briefly, the black gap of a side tunnel at his elbow, as he made out a shapeless huddle on the damp clay a few yards ahead. For a second, he thought it was a mass of earth that had been dislodged from the roof, and then he recognized it as a human body. It was a brown and shriveled mummy, and with a dreadful unbelieving shock, Masson realized that it was moving. It was crawling towards him, and in the pale glow of the flashlight, the man saw a frightful gargoyle face thrust into his own. It was the passionless, death's head skull of a long-dead corpse, instinct with hellish life, and the glazed eyes, swollen and bulbous, betrayed the thing's blindness. It made a faint groaning sound as it crawled towards Masson, stretching its ragged and granulated lips in a grin of dreadful hunger, and Masson was frozen with abysmal fear and loathing. Just before the horror touched him, Masson flung himself frantically into the burrow at his side. He heard a scrambling noise at his heels, and the thing groaned dully as it came after him. Masson, glancing over his shoulder, screamed and propelled himself desperately through the narrow burrow. He crawled along awkwardly, sharp stones cutting his hands and knees. Dirt showered into his eyes, but he dared not pause even for a moment. He scrambled on, gasping, cursing and praying hysterically. Squealing triumphantly, the rats came at him, horrible hunger in their eyes. Masson almost succumbed to their vicious teeth before he succeeded in beating them off. The passage was narrowing, and in a frenzy of terror he kicked and screamed and fired until the hammer clicked on an empty shell. But he had driven them off. He found himself crawling under a great stone embedded in the roof that dug cruelly into his back. It moved a little as his weight struck it, and an idea flashed into Masson's fright-crazed mind. If he could bring down the stone so that it blocked the tunnel. The earth was wet and soggy from the rains, and he hunched himself half upright and dug away at the dirt around the stone. The rats were coming closer. He saw their eyes glowing in the reflection of the flashlight's beam. Still he clawed frantically at the earth. The stone was giving. He tugged at it, and it rocked in its foundation. A rat was approaching, the monster he had already glimpsed. Grey and leprous and hideous, it crept forward with its orange teeth bared, and in its wake came the blind dead thing, groaning as it crawled. Masson gave a last frantic tug at the stone, He felt it slide downwards, and then he went scrambling along the tunnel. Behind him the stone crashed down, and he heard a sudden frightful shriek of agony. Clods showered upon his legs. A heavy weight fell on his feet, and he dragged them free with difficulty. The entire tunnel was collapsing. Gasping with fear, Masson threw himself forward as the soggy earth collapsed at his heels. The tunnel narrowed until he could barely use his hands and legs to propel himself. He wriggled forward like an eel, and suddenly felt satin tearing beneath his clawing fingers, and then his head crashed against something that barred his path. He moved his legs, discovering that they were not pinned under the collapsed earth. He was lying flat on his stomach, and when he tried to raise himself, he found that the roof was only a few inches from his back. Panic shot through him. When the blind horror had blocked his path, he had flung himself desperately into a side tunnel, a tunnel that had no outlet. He was in a coffin, an empty coffin, into which he had crept through the hole the rats had gnawed in its end. He tried to turn on his back and found that he could not. The lid of the coffin pinned him down inexorably. Then he braced himself and strained at the coffin lid. It was immovable, and even if he could escape from the sarcophagus, how could he claw his way up through 5 feet of hard-packed earth? He found himself gasping. It was dreadfully fetid, unbearably hot. In a paroxysm of terror, he ripped and clawed at the satin until it was shredded. He made a futile attempt to dig with his feet at the earth from the collapsed burrow that blocked his retreat. If he were only able to reverse his position, he might be able to claw his way through to air. Air. White-hot agony lanced through his breast, throbbed in his eyeballs. His head seemed to be swelling, growing larger and larger, and suddenly he heard the exultant squealing of the rats. He began to scream insanely but could not drown them out. For a moment he thrashed about hysterically within his narrow prison, and then he was quiet, gasping for air. His eyelids closed, his blackened tongue protruded, and he sank down into the blackness of death with the mad squealing of the rats dinning in his ears. End of The Graveyard Rats by Henry Kuttner. The Secret of Kralitz by Henry Kuttner. Weird Tales. October 1936. A story of the shocking revelation that came to the 21st Baron Kralitz. I awoke from profound sleep to find 2 black-swathed forms standing silently beside me, their faces pale blurs in the gloom. As I blinked to deal my sleep-dimmed eyes, one of them beckoned impatiently, and suddenly I realized the purpose of this midnight summons. For years I had been expecting it, ever since my father, the Baron Kralitz, had revealed to me the secret and the curse that hung over our ancient house. And so, without a word, I rose and followed my guides as they led me along the gloomy corridors of the castle that had been my home since birth. As I proceeded, there rose up in my mind the stern face of my father, and in my ears rang his solemn words as he told me of the legendary curse of the House of Kralitz, the unknown secret that was imparted to the eldest son of each generation at a certain time. When? I had asked my father as he lay on his deathbed, fighting back the approach of dissolution. When you are able to understand, he had told me, watching my face intently from beneath his tufted white brows. Some are told the secret sooner than others. Since the first Baron Kralitz, the secret has been handed down. He clutched at his breast and paused. It was fully 5 minutes before he had gathered his strength to speak again in his rolling, powerful voice. No gasping deathbed confessions for the Baron Kralitz. He said at last, "You have seen the ruins of the old monastery near the village, Franz. The first Baron burnt it and put the monks to the sword. The abbot interfered too often with the Baron's whims. A girl sought shelter, and the abbot refused to give her up at the Baron's demand. His patience was at an end. You know the tales they still tell about him. He slew the abbot, burned the monastery, and took the girl. Before he died, the abbot cursed his slayer and cursed his sons for unborn generations. And it is the nature of this curse that is the secret of our house. I may not tell you what the curse is. Do not seek to discover it before it is revealed to you. Wait patiently, and in due time you will be taken by the warders of the secret down the stairway to the underground cavern, and then you will learn the secret of Kralitz. As the last word passed my father's lips, he died, his stern face still set in its harsh lines. Deep in my memories, I had not noticed our path, but now the dark forms of my guides paused beside a gap in the stone flagging, where a stairway, which I had never seen during my wanderings about the castle, led into subterranean depths. Down this stairway I was conducted, and presently I came to realize that there was light of a sort, a dim phosphorescent radiance that came from no recognizable source, and seemed to be less actual light than the accustoming of my eyes to the near darkness. I went down for a long time. The stairway turned and twisted in the rock, and the bobbing forms ahead were my only relief from the monotony of the interminable descent. And at last, deep underground, the long stairway ended, and I gazed over the shoulders of my guides at the great door that barred my path. It was roughly chiseled from the solid stone, and upon it were curious and strangely disquieting carvings, symbols which I did not recognize. It swung open, and I passed through and paused, staring about me through a grey sea of mist. I stood upon a gentle slope that fell away into the fog-hidden distance, from which came a pandemonium of muffled bellowing and high-pitched, shrill squeakings vaguely akin to obscene laughter. Dark, half-glimpsed shapes swam into sight through the haze and disappeared again, and great vague shadows swept overhead on silent wings. Almost beside me was a long rectangular table of stone, and at this table 200 men were seated, watching me from eyes that gleamed dully out of deep sockets. My 2 guides silently took their places among them, and suddenly the thick fog began to lift. It was swept raggedly away on the breath of a chill wind. The far dim reaches of the cavern were revealed as the mist swiftly dissipated, and I stood silent in the grip of a mighty fear, and strangely, an equally potent, unaccountable thrill of delight. A part of my mind seemed to ask, "What horror is this?" And another part whispered, "You know this place." But I could never have seen it before. If I had realized what lay far beneath the castle, I could never have slept at night for the fear that would have obsessed me. For, standing silent with conflicting tides of horror and ecstasy racing through me, I saw the weird inhabitants of the underground world. Demons, monsters, unnameable things. Nightmare colossi strode bellowing through the murk, and amorphous grey things like giant slugs walked upright on stumpy legs. Creatures of shapeless soft pulp, beings with flame-shot eyes scattered over their misshapen bodies like fabled Argus, writhed and twisted there in the evil glow. Winged things that were not bats swooped and fluttered in the tenebrous air, whispering sibilantly, whispering in human voices. Far away at the bottom of the slope I could see the chill gleam of water, a hidden sunless sea. Shapes mercifully almost hidden by distance, and the semi-darkness sported and cried, troubling the surface of the lake, the size of which I could only conjecture. And a flapping thing whose leathery wings stretched like a tent above my head swooped and hovered for a moment, staring with flaming eyes, and then darted off and was lost in the gloom. And all the while, as I shuddered with fear and loathing, within me was this evil glee, this voice which whispered, "You know this place. You belong here. Is it not good to be home?" I glanced behind me. The great door had swung silently shut, and escape was impossible. And then pride came to my aid. I was a Kralitz, and a Kralitz would not acknowledge fear in the face of the devil himself. I stepped forward and confronted the warders, who were still seated regarding me intently from eyes in which a smouldering fire seemed to burn. Fighting down an insane dread that I might find before me an array of fleshless skeletons, I stepped to the head of the table, where there was a sort of crude throne, and peered closely at the silent figure on my right. It was no bare skull at which I gazed, but a bearded, deadly pale face. The curved, voluptuous lips were crimson, looking almost rouged, and the dull eyes stared through me bleakly. Inhuman agony had etched itself in deep lines on the white face, and gnawing anguish smouldered in dye-sunken eyes. I cannot hope to convey the utter strangeness, the atmosphere of unearthliness that surrounded him, almost as palpable as the fetid tomb stench that welled from his dark garments. He waved a black-swathed arm to the vacant seat at the head of the table, and I sat down. This nightmare sense of unreality. I seemed to be in a dream, with a hidden part of my mind slowly waking from sleep into evil life to take command of my faculties. The table was set with old-fashioned goblets and trenchers, such as had not been used for hundreds of years. There was meat on the trenchers, and red liquor in the jeweled goblets. A heady, overpowering fragrance swam up into my nostrils, mixed with the grave smell of my companions and the musty odor of a dank and sunless place. Every white face was turned to me, faces that seemed oddly familiar, although I did not know why. Each face was alike in its blood-red sensual lips and its expression of gnawing agony, and burning black eyes like the abysmal pits of Tartarus stared at me until I felt the short hairs stir on my neck. But I was a Kralitz. I stood up and said boldly in archaic German that somehow came familiarly from my lips, "I am Franz, 21st Baron Kralitz. What do you want with me?" A murmur of approval went around the long table. There was a stir. From the foot of the board a huge bearded man arose. A man with a frightful scar that made the left side of his face a horror of healed white tissue. Again, the odd thrill of familiarity ran through me. I had seen that face before, and vaguely I remembered looking at it through dim twilight. The man spoke in the old guttural German. "We greet you, Franz, Baron Kralitz. We greet you and pledge you, Franz, and we pledge the House of Kralitz." With that, he caught up the goblet before him and held it high. All along the long table, the black-swathed ones arose, and each held high his jeweled cup and pledged me. They drank deeply, savoring the liquor, and I made the bow custom demanded. I said in words that sprang almost unbidden from my mouth, "I greet you, who are the warders of the Secret of Kralitz, and I pledge you in return. All about me, to the farthermost reaches of the dim cavern, a hush fell, and the bellows and howlings, and the insane tittering of the flying things, were no longer heard. My companions leaned expectantly toward me. Standing alone at the head of the board, I raised my goblet and drank. The liquor was heady, exhilarating, with a faintly brackish flavor. And abruptly, I knew why the pain-racked, ruined face of my companion had seemed familiar. I had seen it often among the portraits of my ancestors, the frowning, disfigured visage of the founder of the House of Kralitz that glared down from the gloom of the great hall. In that fierce white light of revelation, I knew my companions for what they were. I recognized them, one by one, remembering their canvas counterparts. But there was a change. Like an impalpable veil, the stamp of ineradicable evil lay on the tortured faces of my hosts, strangely altering their features, so that I could not always be sure I recognized them. One pale, sardonic face reminded me of my father, but I could not be sure, so monstrously altered was its expression. I was dining with my ancestors, the House of Kralitz. My cup was still held high, and I drained it, for somehow the grim revelation was not entirely unexpected. A strange glow thrilled through my veins, and I laughed aloud for the evil delight that was in me. The others laughed too, a deep-throated merriment like the barking of wolves. Tortured laughter from men stretched on the rack, mad laughter in hell, and all through the hazy cavern came the clamor of the devil's brood. Great figures that towered many spans high rocked with thundering glee, and the flying things tittered slyly overhead, and out over the vast expanse swept the wave of frightful mirth, until the half-seen things in the black waters sent out bellows that tore at my eardrums, and the unseen roof far overhead sent back roaring echoes of the clamour, and I laughed with them, laughed insanely, until I dropped exhausted into my seat and watched the scarred man at the other end of the table as he spoke. "You are worthy to be of our company, and worthy to eat at the same board. We have pledged each other, and you are one of us. We shall eat together." And we fell to, tearing like hungry beasts at the succulent white meat in the jeweled trenchers. Strange monsters served us, and at a chill touch on my arm I turned to find a dreadful crimson thing, like a skinned child, refilling my goblet. Strange, and utterly blasphemous was our feast. We shouted and laughed and fed there in the hazy light, while all around us thundered the evil horde. There was hell beneath Castle Kralitz, and it held high carnival this night. Presently we sang a fierce drinking song, swinging the deep cups back and forth in rhythm with our shouted chant. It was an archaic song, but the obsolete words were no handicap, for I mouthed them as though they had been learned at my mother's knee, and at the thought of my mother, a trembling and a weakness ran through me abruptly, but I banished it with a draught of the heady liquor. Long we shouted and sang and caroused there in the great cavern, and after a time we arose together and trooped to where a narrow, high-arched bridge spanned the tenebrous waters of the lake. But I may not speak of what was at the other end of the bridge, nor of the unnameable things that I saw and did. I learned of the fungoid, inhuman beings that dwell on far cold Yaggdytha, of the cyclopean shapes that attend unsleeping Cthulhu in his submarine city, of the strange pleasures that the followers of Leprous, subterranean Azathoth may possess, and I learned too of the unbelievable manner in which Iod, the source, is worshipped beyond the outer galaxies. I plumbed the blackest pits of hell and came back, laughing. I was one with the rest of those dark warders, and I joined them in the Saturnalia of horror until the scarred man spoke to us again. "Our time grows short," he said, his scarred and bearded white face like a gargoyle's in the half-light. "We must depart soon. But you are a true Kralitz, Franz, and we shall meet again, and feast again, and make merry for longer than you think. One last pledge." I gave it to him. "To the house of Kralitz, may it never fall." And with an exultant shout we drained the pungent dregs of the liquor. Then a strange lassitude fell upon me. With the others I turned my back on the cavern and the shapes that pranced and bellowed and crawled there, and I went up through the carved stone portal. We filed up the stairs, up and up, endlessly, until at last we emerged through the gaping hole in the stone flags and proceeded, a dark, silent company, back through those interminable corridors. The surroundings began to grow strangely familiar, and suddenly I recognized them. We were in the great burial vaults below the castle, where the barons Kralitz were ceremoniously entombed. Each baron had been placed in his stone casket in his separate chamber, and each chamber lay like beads on a necklace, adjacent to the next. So that we proceeded from the farthermost tombs of the early barons Kralitz toward the unoccupied vaults. By immemorial custom, each tomb lay bare, an empty mausoleum, until the time had come for its use, when the great stone coffin, with the memorial inscription carved upon it, would be carried to its place. It was fitting, indeed, for the secret of Kralitz to be hidden here. Abruptly I realized that I was alone, save for the bearded man with the disfiguring scar. The others had vanished, and deep in my thoughts, I had not missed them. My companion stretched out his black swathed arm and halted my progress, and I turned to him questioningly. He said in his sonorous voice, "I must leave you now. I must go back to my own place." And he pointed to the way whence we had come. I nodded, for I had already recognized my companions for what they were. I knew that each Baron Kralitz had been laid in his tomb, only to arise as a monstrous thing neither dead nor alive, to descend into the cavern below and take part in the evil Saturnalia. I realized, too, that with the approach of dawn they had returned to their stone coffins to lie in a death-like trance until the setting sun should bring brief liberation. My own occult studies had enabled me to recognize these dreadful manifestations. I bowed to my companion and would have proceeded on my way to the upper parts of the castle, but he barred my path. He shook his head slowly, his scar hideous in the phosphorescent gloom. I said, "May I not go yet?" He stared at me with tortured, smoldering eyes that had looked into hell itself, and he pointed to what lay beside me. And, in a flash of nightmare realization, I knew the secret of the curse of Kralitz. There came to me the knowledge that made my brain a frightful thing, in which shapes of darkness would ever swirl and scream, the dreadful comprehension of when each Baron Kralitz was initiated into the Brotherhood of Blood. I knew that no coffin had ever been placed unoccupied in the tombs, and I read upon the stone sarcophagus at my feet the inscription that made my doom known to me, my own name, Franz, 21st Baron Kralitz. End of The Secret of Kralitz by Henry Kuttner. The Eater of Souls by Henry Kuttner. Weird Tales. January 1937. They tell it in Beljarnak, in a language not of earth, that a malignant and terrible being once dwelt in that incredible abyss named the Grey Gulf of Yarnak. Not on Earth, nor on any planet that spins about any star in the skies we know, is Beljarnak, but beyond Betelgeuse, beyond the giant stars. On a green and joyous world, still in its lusty youth, are the towers and silver minarets of this city. Nor are the dwellers in Beljarnak anthropoid, nor in any way man-like, yet there are fires during the long warm nights in curious hearths, and wherever in this universe there are fires, there will be tales told about them, and breathless listeners to bring contentment to the heart of the teller of tales. The Sindara rules benignantly over Beljarnak, yet in the old days fear and doom lay like a shroud over the land, and in the grey gulf of Yarnak a brooding horror dwelt loathsomely, and a strange enchantment chilled the skies and hid the triple moons behind a darkened pall. For a being had come to glut its evil hunger in the land, and those who dwelt in Beljarnak called it the Eater of Souls. In no wise could this being be described, for none had seen it save under circumstances which precluded the possibility of return. Yet in the gulf it brooded, and when its hunger stirred it would send forth a soundless summons, so that in tavern and temple, by fireside and in the blackness of the night, some would rise slowly, with a passionless look of death upon their features, and would depart from Beljarnak toward the grey gulf. Nor would they ever return. It was said that the thing in the gulf was half a demon and half a god, and that the souls of those whom it slew served it eternally, fulfilling strange missions in the icy wastes between the stars. This being had come from the dark sun, the hydromancers said, where it had been conceived by an unholy alliance between those timeless ancients who filter strangely between the universes and a black shining one of unknown origin. The necromancers said other things, but they hated the hydromancers, who were powerful then, and their rune-casting was generally discredited. Yet the Sindara listened to both schools of mages, and pondered upon his throne of Chalcedony, and presently determined to set forth voluntarily to the great gulf of Yarnak, which was reputed to be bottomless. The necromancers gave the Sindara curious implements made of the bones of the dead, and the hydromancers gave him intricately twisted transparent tubes of crystal, which would be useful in battling the Eater of Souls. Thereafter the necromancers and the hydromancers squatted on their haunches in the city gate, and howled dismally as the Sindara rode westward on his Gorlak, that fleet but repugnantly shaped reptile. After a time, the Sindara discarded both the weapons of the hydromancers and the necromancers, for he was a worshipper of Vorvadoss, as had been each Sindara in his time. None might worship Vorvadoss save the Sindara of Belyanak, for such is the god's command, and presently the Sindara dismounted from his gorlak and prayed fervently to Vorvadoss. For a time there was no response. Then the sands were troubled, and a whirling and dancing of mist motes blinded the Sindara. Out of the maelstrom the god spoke thinly, and his voice was like the tinkling of countless tiny crystal goblets. "Thou goest to doom," Vorvadoss said ominously. "But thy son sleeps in Belyanak, and I shall have a worshipper when thou art vanished. Go therefore fearlessly, since God cannot conquer God, but only man who created him." Speaking thus cryptically, Vorvadoss withdrew, and the Sindara, after pondering, continued his journey. In time he came to that incredible abyss from which men say the nearer moon was born, and at its edge he fell prone and lay sick and shuddering, peering down into mist-shrouded emptiness. For a cold wind blew up from the gulf, and it seemed to have no bottom. Looming far in the distance, he could just discern the further brink. Clambering up the rough stones came he whom the Sindara had set out to find. He came swiftly, making use of his multiple appendages to lift himself. He was white and hairy and appallingly hideous, but his misshapen head came only to the Sindara's waist, although in girth his spidery limbs rendered a shocking illusion of hugeness. In his wake came the souls he had taken for his own. They were a plaintive whispering and stirring in the air, swooping and moaning and sighing for lost nirvana. The Sindara drew his blade and struck at his enemy. Of that battle sagas are still sung, for it raged along the brink for a timeless interval of eternity. In the end, the Sindara was hacked and bleeding and spent, and his opponent was untouched and chuckling loathsomely. Then the demon prepared for his meal. Into the Sindara's mind came a whisper, the thin calling of Vorvadoss. He said, "There are many kinds of flesh in the universes, and other compounds which are not flesh. Thus doth the Eater of Souls feed." And he told the Sindara of the incredible manner of that feeding, of the fusing of two beings, of the absorption of the lesser, and of the emergence therefrom of an augmented half-god. While the uncaged soul flew moaning in the train of those who served the being, into the Sindara's mind came knowledge, and with it a grim resolve. He flung wide his arms and welcomed the ghastly embrace, for Vorvadoss had also spoken of the manner in which the doom might be lifted. The thing sprang to meet him, and an intolerable agony ground frightfully within the Sindara's bone and flesh. The citadel of his being rocked, and his soul cowered shrieking in its chamber. There on the edge of the grey gulf of Yarnak, a monstrous fusion took place, a metamorphosis and a commingling that was blasphemous and horrible beyond all imagining. As a thing disappears in quicksand, so the being and the Sindara melted into each other's body. Yet even in that blinding agony, a sharper pain came to the Sindara, as he saw across the plain the beauty of this land over which he had ruled. He thought he had never seen anything so beautiful as this green and joyous land of his, and a pain was in his heart, a sense of empty loss and an aching void which could not ever be filled. And he looked away to the black evil eyes of the Eater of Souls that were but inches away from his own, and he looked beyond the being to where cold emptiness lay grey and horrible. There were tears in his eyes and a gnawing ache in his heart for the silver minarets and towers of Belyanak that had lain naked and beautiful beneath the glowing light of the triple moons. For he should never see that place any more. He turned his head again, and for the last time, blinded with his tears and with his doom upon him. As he leaped forward, he heard a despairing shriek, and then half god and man were spinning dizzily downward, seeing the precipice rushing up past them. For Vorvadoss had said that thus and only thus could the spell be lifted. And the cliff wall curved inward as it swept down, so presently it receded into the dim grey haze. and the Sindara fell in empty mist and into final, unstirring darkness. End of The Eater of Souls by Henry Kuttner. The Jest of Droom-avista by Henry Kuttner. Weird Tales, 1937. There is a tale they tell of voices that called eerily by night in the marble streets of long-fallen Bel-Yarnak, saying, "Evil is come to the land, doom falls on the fair city where our children's children walk. Woe, woe unto Bel-Yarnak." Then did the dwellers in the city gather affrightedly in huddled groups, casting furtive glances at the black minaret that spears up gigantically from the temple gardens. For as all men know, when doom comes to Bel-Yarnak, the black minaret will play its part in that dreadful Ragnarok. Woe, woe unto Bel-Yarnak! Fallen forever are the shining silver towers, lost the magic, soiled the glamour. For stealthily, and by night, under the triple moons that hurtle swiftly across the velvet sky, doom crept out inexorably from the black minaret. Mighty magicians were the priests of the black minaret. Mighty were they, alchemists and sorcerers, and always they sought the stone of the philosophers, that strange power which would enable them to transmute all things into the rarest of metals. And in a vault far below the temple gardens, toiling endlessly at glittering alembics and shining crucibles, lit by the violet glow of Okuru lamps, stood Thorazar, mightiest of priests, wisest of all who dwelt in Bel-Yarnak. Days and weeks and years he had toiled, while strange moons reeled down to the horizons, seeking the elixir. Gold and silver paved the streets, blazing diamonds, moon-glowing opals, purple gems of strange fire, meteor fallen, made of Bel-Yarnak a splendid vision, shining by night to guide the weary traveler across the sandy wastes. But a rarer element Thorazar sought. Other worlds possessed it, for the intricate telescopes of the astronomers revealed its presence in the flaming suns that fill the chaotic sky, making night over Bel-Yarnak a mirror reflecting the blazing scintillance of the city, a star-carpeted purple tapestry where the triple moons weave their arabesque patterns. So toiled Thorazar under the black minaret, all of glistening jet onyx. He failed, and again he failed, and at length he knew that only with the gods' aid could he find the elixir he sought. Not the little gods, nor the gods of good and evil, but Droom-avista, the dweller beyond, the dark shining one, Thorazar called up blasphemously from the abyss. For Thorazar's brain was warped, he had toiled endlessly, and foiled as often, in his mind was but one thought. So he did that which is forbidden, he traced the 7 circles, and spoke the name which wakens Droom-avista from his brooding sleep. A shadow swept down, darkening over the black minaret. Yet Bel-Yarnak was untroubled, glorious and beautiful. The shining city glowed while thin voices called weirdly in the streets. Woe, woe unto Bel-Yarnak! For the shadow darkened and encompassed the black minaret, and midnight black closed ominously about the sorcerer Thorazar. All alone he stood in his chamber, no gleam of light relieving the awful darkness that heralded the coming of the dark shining one. And slowly, ponderously, there rose up before him a shape. But Thorazar cried out and hid his eyes, for none may look upon the dweller beyond lest his soul be blasted forever. Like the groaning tocsin of a cyclopean bell came the voice of the dweller, rumbling terribly under the black minaret. Yet only Thorazar heard it, for he alone had called up Droom-avista. "Now my sleep is troubled," the god cried. "Now my dreams are shattered, and I must weave new visions. Many worlds, a mightier cosmos, have you ruined, yet there are other worlds and other dreams, and perchance I shall find amusement in this little planet. For is not one of my names the Jester?" Shuddering and fearful, still hiding his eyes, Thorazar spoke. "Great Droom-avista, I know your name, I have said it. By the doom even upon you, you must obey one command of him who calls you up. The darkness throbbed and pulsed. Ironically, Droom-avista assented. "Command then, O little fool, command your god. For always have men sought to enslave gods, and ever have they succeeded too well." Yet Thorazor heeded not the warning. One thought only had he, the elixir, the mighty magic that would transmute all things into the rarest of elements, and to Droom-avista he spoke fearlessly. He said his desire. "But is that all?" the god said slowly. "Now this is but a small thing for which to disturb my slumber. So shall I grant your desire, for am I not named the Jester? Do thus and thus." And Droom-avista spoke of that which would transmute all things into the rarest of metals on Belyanak. Then the god withdrew, and the shadow lifted. Again Droom-avista sank into his dreaming sleep, weaving intricate cosmogonies, and speedily he forgot Thorazor. But the sorcerer stood in his chamber, trembling with exultation, for at his feet lay a jewel. This had the god left behind. Flaming, blazing, streaming with weird fire, the gem illuminated the dark chamber, driving the shadows back into the distant corners. Yet Thorazor had not eyes for its beauty. This was the philosopher's stone, this the elixir. A glory was in the wizard's eyes as he prepared a brew as Droom-avista had commanded. Then the mixture seethed and bubbled in the golden crucible, and over it Thorazor held the shining jewel. The culmination of a lifetime's hopes was reached as he dropped the gem into the frothing brew. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, slowly at first, but with increasing swiftness, the golden crucible changed in color, slowly darkening. Thorazor cried out, blessing Droom-avista, for the crucible was no longer golden. It had been transmuted, by the power of the jewel, into the rarest of metals. The gem, as though lighter than the bubbling mixture, lay lightly on the liquid surface. But the metamorphosis was not yet complete. The darkness crept down the pedestal that supported the crucible. It spread out like a fungoid stain across the onyx floor. It reached the feet of Thorazor, and the sorcerer stood frozen, glaring down at the frightful transmutation that was changing his body from flesh and blood into solid metal. And in a flash of blinding realization, Thorazor knew Droom-avista's jest, and knew that by the power of the elixir, all things are changed to the rarest of elements. He shrieked once, and then his throat was no longer flesh. And slowly, slowly, the stain spread across the floor and up the stone walls of the chamber. The shining onyx dulled and lost its sheen, and the hungry stain crept out through the black minaret, out upon Belyanak, while the thin voices cried sadly in the marble streets. Woe, woe unto Belyanak! Fallen is the glory, dulled and tarnished the gold and silver splendor, cold and lifeless the beauty of the magic citadel. For outward and ever outward crept the stain, and in its path all was changed. The people of Belyanak no longer move light-heartedly about their houses. Lifeless images throng the streets and palaces. Immovable and silent sits the Sindara on a tarnished throne. Dark and grim looms the city under the hurtling moons. It is the damned city, and sad voices in the silent metropolis mourn for lost glory. Fallen is Belyanak, changed by the magic of Thorazor and by Droom-avista's jest, changed to the rarest of all elements in the planet of gold and silver and shining gems. No longer Belyanak, it is Dis, the city of iron. End of the Jest of Droom-avista by Henry Kuttner.